Okay. Well, Joelle, I'm excited to chat with you one-on-one about your book. I mean, we've known each other kind of virtually for several years now. And I think when we first connected, you were in one of the very early drafts of this memoir. So it's super exciting, especially for those of us who've known you a little bit longer, to see it out in the world. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. Great to speak with you today, Jill. I know we've
Yeah.
spoken at other times about our writing, and it's so good to be at this point with you.
Yeah, I bet. How does it feel to have a book out in the world, a book you've been working on for so long?
At the very beginning, it's quite overwhelming, actually. The lead up is great, and I felt really excited about the reactions and the early reviews. And then once it's out there, it's a little bit of a shock that first week or two. I've arrived, now what? But since then, the feeling settled in, and I'm obviously very happy to be at this point. And
Mhm.
no regrets as to the timing, and just getting used to the feeling of it being out there and what are the next steps and what do I want to focus on now?
Sure, sure. Well, so I'm curious, I think there are probably lots of people who feel like they have a story, a personal story they want to tell. So what was it for you that took a story and then in your mind made it into something that you said, okay, I'm going to write this and it's going to be a memoir and I'm going to put it out there. What prompted that?
Yeah, you've read the book and others who may be listening have read it. It was a story where I didn't really know what was happening while it was happening. I thought I was living this amazing thing and only to awaken and say, "Oh my gosh, I've actually been deceived," and the terrible realization that everything I've lived has been a lie. So it was a very big realization, and I felt like somewhere I'm going to be telling this story. At the end of the events, I thought I really want to share this story in case there have been others who might have experienced something similar. I mean, I realize that this cannot be unique. We're billions of people on the
Right.
planet. There's no way this has only happened to me. Yet, it's not the kind of story that's often talked about. Or
Mm,
when it is we hear about cult scenarios, and I have read cult memoirs of people who'd been in cults. Now, a lot of them were from childhood. So, an
mm,
educated or unfollow, or even something that isn't a cult, but even something like the Glass Castle. And more recently, I've read Uncultured. All those memoirs deal with terrible things that happen in childhood and how the protagonist, if we can call them that, the narrator, evolved and became who they are today.
right.
Whereas this felt like it happened when I should have known better. Yet when I explored the story, I said, well, 22 is young, and I evolved in my thinking about the story. And it took me a long time to realize what had happened, how it had happened. And yeah, I felt like I wanted to share it. And in the beginning, I didn't think at all about who would read it. And up to the last minute, there were a few people that I was just worried about them reading it. And some of them have been very appreciative of the story. So sometimes these worries are more about us than about the audience.
Right, right. So when you first were thinking this might be helpful, other people have gone through this, how did you start writing? Were you thinking chronologically? Did you say, okay, let me go back to the beginning? What was the beginning? Or did you just start gushing forward with various memories and had to piece them together later? What was that process like?
Yeah, when I first started, looking back, it was probably too soon. I started a year after my divorce, and I was thinking chronologically. I was thinking from setting my eyes on this man that was the, what do we call it, the inciting incident. I don't
Okay.
think it really was, but like that's where I started. And those efforts didn't go too far. So then I left it to the side. And a few years later, so now we're about 5 years on from my divorce, I attended a writing day that had writing prompts. And I just responded to those prompts without thinking specifically about my memoir or even what I'd write about. In fact, one of my responses had nothing to do with this memoir. So it really wasn't deliberate, but
Mhm.
I was drawing on some of my most difficult moments or things that had made me think and ponder. And those were not chronological at all. And
Mhm.
on the back of that, I went back and started writing. Now, I went back and started writing chronologically, which is pretty natural, but is not always the easiest way to be creative. And then after a few different drafts, I figured out where to start the story and not to start it where I thought the beginning was.
Right. I love that you use writing prompts because I do find that prompts are this somewhat artificial mechanism, but it's a way to unlock something in us that we don't surface ourselves because it's something that someone else is offering you almost. And if you're just responding to that, you do go with a little bit of your subconscious. Whereas if you start writing, it's usually with an intention. So it's with your conscious brain. So I like that. Okay, so you started writing and now you're writing a little bit chronologically. And I imagine there were moments where you said, oh, what happened next? Like, I can't remember, there was a gap or maybe certain details. So for other memoir writers, what were the most useful techniques that you used to really tap into the full story, the memories, the chronology? How did you piece this together?
Yeah, I think there was a few mechanisms, Jill. I mean, one was going back to journals of the time, if not to really pick up on specific events, but at least to pick up on the mood and, what I was feeling and thinking throughout those years. I didn't keep up journals the entire time, but there were large chunks of time where I did have journals.
Mhm.
So that helped. I consulted them a little bit late in retrospect. I think I would advise memoirists, if you have them, to look at them a bit earlier. I wonder why sometimes we don't think of doing that first of all. I think we want to set off into the writing, as you said, with intention and then think, well, what do I do next? But then I think the hardest part in terms of memories was really remembering, what it was like to be that young and what I was really feeling at the time.
Mhm.
And for that, I used music. I found that music was very helpful because it's the absence of words and just puts you right back into a scene, especially if you don't listen to that type of music anymore. When you were listening to that type of music, what did it feel like? Where were you? What was the mood like, the history, etc. So I think music was actually quite helpful. And it helped me to also suspend that critical thinking of why in the heck did this happen to me and just step back and
Right.
be like, I'm there. This is actually appealing. I don't know the end. When you write a memoir, you know what happens at the end. And they say you have to be careful not to write from that point of view because
Right.
then your reader will probably not join you on the journey either because you're already kind of preempting the end. But if at the beginning you remember and take the reader slowly through what that felt like, music was helpful. And also there were some details that were hard to remember. Not a lot because I had key scenes in mind. If anything, Jill, I probably had more scenes than I needed. I
Mm.
feel like there are some good scenes that are not in the final book simply because something has to give.
Right.
And you make some choices in writing. I'm sure it's the same with fiction. I had more scenes than I needed. So enough material, if you will, to convince the reader of my story. But what was harder was really making it believable.
Right. How about some of the setting details? Were you able to go back to any parts of France that you lived in or India during your writing journey? Or did you have to really reach in and try to remember some of the visuals and maybe some of the sensory experiences?
Yeah, that's a great point. I have not been back to India since 2012. It's
Oh,
on
wow.
my
Okay.
agenda sometime. But it's not been top of mind as I must go back, but I'd like to someday.
Right.
And I really wonder what I'll feel like because some of
Mm.
the most emotional moments, with Arun took place in India, notably becoming attracted to him, but also going back and that plan of retiring there and what that meant to me at a different point in my life. So, with India, there were sometimes I did look up Rishikesh in a YouTube video some
Oh,
point
interesting.
just to remember because I was already writing about Rishikesh, but I was wondering if I was doing it justice. And obviously, between memory and then something as clear as a video, there's a bit of a gap. But I
Right.
do tend to have a good memory of places and what were some of the details that came up for me when I think about India. And then for Paris, obviously easier to get back to, and I have gone back there. And again, a lot of it I remembered. I mean, details of a lot of the scenes are in an apartment or in the yoga school. And obviously, I haven't been able to go back to those places. I have gone
Right.
back to the yoga school once, but it was completely refurbished by the current owner who kept it
Sure.
as a yoga school. So again, was more of a flashback for me, but not that relevant for the story.
Right.
Uh, but what's interesting when you go back is you are a different person. So with the Paris experience, when I go back there, then yes, there's a gap between how I felt then in Paris and how I feel now, and that's the like the passage of time.
Right. Right. So this is a really emotional story, and I'm curious about the process of writing and how those emotions come up and how you manage your emotions, or I don't know if you want to talk about this, you don't have to, but I imagine that you would almost want to seek out therapy or someone to talk to alongside the process of writing, because, especially kind of in a post-traumatic situation, a lot is stirred up.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me too now. I will share, I don't mind my sharing that no, I did not go through therapy either right on the back of ending that relationship or while writing. There's no
Mhm.
specific reason for that. So I'm not here as an advocate of don't go to therapy, well, quite the contrary. And most of the memoirs that I have read, although not all, but there are some memoirs that do include, what's discussed and what comes up in therapy sessions. In my case, I think I felt like I had a handle on the situation and I just wrote about it. I didn't think the writing was therapy. It's not that I assumed that it would replace person to person therapy, but I knew for sure that it was going to be my way of grappling with what had happened. It's kind of an intellectual way of approaching it because actually you're having to think all the time
Right.
about, like, I was asking myself questions a lot of the time. So yes, it is emotional. It's probably more emotional to have published it in a strange way than to have
Right.
written it. Not what I thought was going to be, difficult, i.e., exposing a story that had been kept secret, but more of the feelings about it are now able to flow because the product is done. And I'm reading more about relationships like this that didn't occur in childhood and what actually happens in a couple in this kind of, you could call it codependent relationship, although mine went further than even
Mhm.
codependency, I feel, because it had the whole element of abuse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I'm curious also about, some of these stories are not 100% flattering about everyone who's involved. And so as you thought through, okay, I'm going to put this out in the world, these stories will be made public. At any point, did you seek permission or forgiveness, or did you share certain scenes or maybe the entire manuscript with anyone who's depicted in the book? And how did you kind of reconcile, if there was anyone who maybe pushed back a little bit, how did you reconcile that with your own goal of writing, your truth?
Yeah, I mean, I knew of certain characters in the story that would not want the story published, so I did not seek out their permission, but what I did was change, who they were, their persona in the story. So the role is the role that they had. So it's
Mhm.
true to that. But I tried to disguise other elements so that they wouldn't be so obvious and wouldn't feel like I divulged their identity. In terms of my immediate family, my parents have both read it. I did want them to know what I was saying. Although the story isn't directly about them, they are important figures and influences in there. And my father didn't ask for any changes, but my mother wanted a couple of changes that made a lot of sense or that didn't change the story. It was maybe a wording here and there about something that had happened. And I was glad to have been able to have had that exchange so that they wouldn't be shocked. I certainly didn't want them to be shocked by the story coming out and them not having read it.
Okay. Yeah. It sounds like you didn't necessarily get any pushback in terms of like someone that you're still very close to saying, don't publish this or delete my character or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't, I was surprised. I didn't know how, as I say, my mother would feel about it, but she's been very supportive of me publishing the story. So
That's great.
take that as
I
a
don't know. I don't know if that's rare or not. It feels like it might. I feel like it. I don't know. I don't know if it's rare, but
Yeah, I've heard of a few others, like Mary Carr for the Liars Club, where
mhm.
her mother is a major character in that. But apparently, she did tell her mother she was writing it and allowed her to see the story as one example. Obviously, there may be
Right.
others that we don't know about, but
Yeah.
yeah, normally what I have seen with memoirs is when you feel you need to tell a story, there's not a lot that's going to get in your way of telling it, unless you really feel like you might be breaching some kind of legal right. But
Right.
I did research that and I did think about it. And essentially, as long as you don't commit libel and say anything that someone didn't do, then you're allowed to tell your story.
Then you're fine. Okay. That's good to know. What was the hardest part of the writing process for you?
Yeah, all of it. Now, you know yourself who've written long works. I think I'm okay at getting the words on the page. I tend not to censor myself early or set very high standards. I feel like if I were to do that, I wouldn't be able to progress. So I tend to be able to just get the words down. The editing rounds were many.
Okay.
In a sense, that took longer than I expected. And I'm hopeful that a next book will not take as long, but I'm not sure that's the case. So he had many editing rounds and
Mhm.
really striking the right note in some of the most difficult scenes for me, between too emotional and too cold. You're just finding the right way, because there's a gap, right, between what you feel and then how you say it. And
Right.
particularly if a scene I think is very emotional, then, striking that right tone was probably the hardest thing in the writing. And
Mm.
then I had a couple of developmental editors. They were helpful in pointing out where the tension was lagging, or where a scene wasn't needed, or where I needed to tighten things up. So
Mhm.
there's things I couldn't see for myself that I needed, some
Right.
professional help to give an opinion on.
Right. So you said that editing took a while. As you think about writing a second memoir, what will be different about that revision process? I mean, is it like, okay, you found the right developmental editor now, and so that's going to take less time? Or do you think just the knowledge that you've accumulated is going to make you better at self-editing? Or how will that be different?
I'm hoping it's the latter. I'm hoping I've accumulated some knowledge. I also think the stories are different. It'll be interesting to see how I feel about writing the next one. I have a couple of different angles in mind, but one is a really more of a family childhood memoir, which I'm really kind of keen to get started on. Not in terms of timing, giving myself a deadline, but my thinking is going in that direction, because when you finish a story like mine, and especially perhaps not having gone through therapy, you really do start to think about, well, these things don't come out of the blue, and what might have been some of the antecedents or some of the reasons that I was particularly susceptible to someone like Arun.
Right.
So I'm hoping that I have learned something about editing, but also just taking my time more. And I will not be as much trying to piece together facts, although of course that's
Mhm.
part of it, but just trying to get those scenes out there and seeing what arc emerges. Because I think with this first memoir, there was a clear arc, beginning, middle, and
Right.
end. But the next one, it's more fluid in my mind as to what that might be. So that
Right.
may be harder or easier. I don't know.
Okay. Um, Last question about the writing process before we kind of shift to publishing. You said you went through, multiple rounds of revisions and edits and multiple developmental editors. How did you know when it was done? When you said, okay, ship it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, prior to the second developmental editor, I had already started query agents. So in
Okay.
theory, I thought I was, done then.
Hmm.
But at the point where I worked with the second developmental editor, I wanted him to take a very commercial view on the book and say, does it work as a piece of writing that people will want to read? Like,
Okay.
how does it work on that level? So, and in terms of being done, I mean, I felt then, this was earlier this year in the beginning of 23, it took about 2 months to put in place all his revisions. So the revision process accelerates. It's not like there was endless amounts of work to do
Okay.
on the basis of his feedback. And then I just thought, look, I've got to move on with this and go to the next step. I thought if I ever were going to go back to this kind of manuscript, it would be a completely different book that I don't have a vision for. So I'm kind of happy with where it is, so to speak. Any story can be told very differently, but
Right.
no one had said tell it in a completely different way, not even my beta readers like yourself. So, people were okay with the flow of it. So from that point of view, I said, I'm done.
Right. Okay. Let's shift gears to talking about publishing. And you alluded to having queried agents. So it sounds like you were open to various publishing paths from the beginning. So walk me through a little bit of that. How long did you query? What made you decide, okay, let's go with self-publishing, et cetera?
The manuscript felt like it was ready in the middle of 2022. So I had a pitch together, which I'd had for a while, and I had an initial positive response to putting the pitch out there on an online event. And
Mhm.
so that, made me really think seriously about querying an agent, and I rushed through a query because I
Uh-huh.
felt like I needed to immediately respond and have something before this agent forgot about me. I waited a few weeks, nothing happened with that particular agent. And then I did enter my manuscript in a manuscript competition and it was longlisted. So that also felt, quite positive. So that was in June of 22. And then I started querying in August of last year.
Mhm.
And I put together a list. It's a little bit harder, I find, in terms of agents who are really interested in memoir. There are
Mhm.
some, and I'm sure there's more, and searches can be more exhaustive, but I kept looking for Memoir, and it really boiled it down to 25 agents. That's a very small number. But I did
Yeah.
query them all over about, I would say, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, in small batches.
Mhm.
And, I just wasn't sure from the beginning whether they would take a real commercial angle on my story. And I think that probably kept me from pushing harder
Right.
on the agent path. I just thought, well, it's such a personal story and there's these different elements to it. Will they see something that they can sell? Because I was very aware that an agent only takes up a manuscript that they feel they can sell. The
Mhm.
reason I was aware is I've attended a number of agent webinars or agent Q&As, be they live, most of them online, and they really tell you very honestly, look, I may be reading books that couldn't take on. So
Right.
my reading taste may be for slow, beautiful writing, but that's not what I can sell. So they're quite open, not only about what they think can sell in the market, but also what their contacts are into the publishing world.
Sure.
So I just wasn't sure, and I was waiting for responses. And at the same time, I said, well, let me prepare myself for an independent path at the same time. And that's when I enlisted the second developmental edit. And I thought to myself, it could also be useful no matter what happens. And by the time I decided to independently publish, most of the agents had had my query for months, and not hearing back from all but five just
Mhm.
made me feel like it was unlikely that the story would be picked up traditionally.
Right. Yeah. I mean, all I ever hear is that memoirs are so hard to get agent rep and then to sell. I mean, from the sound of it, much harder than most fiction. So I think there are
Yeah,
probably lots of people in your shoes where you have a book that is an excellent book and a really engaging story, but if an agent doesn't think they can sell it, then you have other options. So
yeah.
did you consider going with either small presses that don't require an agent, or did you know that if it wasn't an agent path that you wanted to independently publish?
Yeah, I looked into that, and I think the key is to find the right press, because I found that some of the independent presses, still require an agent, so obviously those won't work.
Right.
And then there's a next level that doesn't require an agent, and I would really need to be confident that that's a good press for me to work with.
Mhm.
So in the end, I decided that the best way was independently if I couldn't be represented by an agent. It's something I would review maybe in the future and see what other options are out there for another book. I also heard mixed stories from people who'd gone, particularly with very small presses, where they felt like they still had to do all the work. So I was wondering, what does the press offer? So I think that's what I would look into in the future, is what does the press bring to the table?
That
Uh,
you can't do on your
yeah,
own.
yeah.
Yeah, right. I think it's a really good point.
Mm.
So, okay, so now you've said this is my path, I'm going to independently publish. What resources did you turn? I mean, I know very little about independently publishing, so I would immediately kind of look out and be like, okay, what are the main websites, or are there, forums that you go to, conferences, etc.? What were the best resources for you to learn about independent publishing?
Well, one thing I did is I asked people who had independently published either memoir or literary fiction. And I think
Okay.
they were great examples for me that it can be done in books that are similar to my genre.
Mhm.
So they basically told me where to go. And when you actually look into it, the publishing process is pretty straightforward online through KDP for Amazon and through Ingram Spark for bookstores. And
Right.
that's really the only two places that I've gone so far. I haven't branched out to other ebook publishers like Apple, Kobo, etc. I think if I get to that point, then again, I'd be really looking to their websites to tell me how to
How
place
to
my
do it.
book there. So, and then in terms of online presence and marketing, I'm really picking up whatever I can from Facebook, from Twitter, from what other authors have done, from listening to webinars. And so I haven't had just a single source of knowledge, but really asking other authors has been helpful.
Okay. So no particular, I don't know, podcasts that come to mind, or I don't know if there's a book. I mean, who uses books these days as like our
No,
go-to
people
resource?
do.
The information changes so quickly that I feel like books about publishing are often out of print, as soon as they're published.
No, I mean, I did read two. There's the books by Joanna Penn. She talks
Mhm.
about independent publishing. And David Gaughran, I think it's pronounced. He also wrote Let's Go Digital. So those
Okay.
are the two. And I think they're great overviews. So you feel like you can situate yourself and you have a bit of a roadmap and you do this and this and this, and it walks you through the process. I think the only thing I would say, though, is that every book is truly different, particularly memoir or literary fiction.
Okay.
So my hunch is the advice works very well for people who are writing in genre and
Mhm.
also for authors who are planning to write at a pretty fast pace.
Right.
So there's a lot about, the second book sells the first and the push through rate and the building your readers. And that makes sense to me. And I
Mhm.
think people have been hugely successful online, as we know, with things like romance, like Colleen Hoover, or thrillers and mysteries.
Right.
So you can be very successful independently publishing in genre. I'm not saying that these tips won't work for books that are more standalone or maybe take longer to write, but I'd say they need to be modified some.
Sure.
And I'm still trying to figure that out. Exactly what is the right way. And I'm now just looking for more help on the marketing side because
Okay.
I'm finding it tricky. I mean, there is Amazon ads, which is the big element that should be used, but even that takes a while to figure out what works for one, particular book.
So you said that in an email to me earlier, you said the operational side was surprisingly straightforward or easy to
Yeah.
understand, by which I assume you mean sort of getting it formatted for the e-reader or for print and all of that.
I
How have
will tell you one thing on that is, again, this comes from my author friends. Both of them recommended vellum for the typesetting. I found that very straightforward from taking my book
okay.
out of Word into vellum, getting it typeset nicely. That's been surprisingly easy. I was worried about some small things like my copyright page, what goes in there. These are
Uh-huh.
things you can Google or look up in other books. I'm based here in the UK, so I matched it more closely to UK published books. Like, for example, I reference the British Library, having made a legal deposit there, things like that.
Right.
Writing your acknowledgments. There's all these pieces of the operational side that really slot into place because ultimately you can do them. So yes, just to say that's what I
Right.
meant by that's not the most difficult part of the puzzle.
Sure. What pieces have you contracted out? I know that you worked with a designer for the cover, right?
Yep.
How did you find your designer?
I use the platform Readsy.
You did. Okay.
Yeah, I did use Readsy for the designer. And I based it on what other covers they'd done just to see
Mhm.
where my affinities lay, what seemed to fit my genre. And there
Right.
were a lot of iterations of the cover. And that's one thing I'll be prepared for next time.
Uh-huh. And how about, I don't know, a copy editor or a line editor? Did you ever use those or just a developmental
No, I did. I used a proofreader. So
proofreader? Okay.
my last edit was a combination developmental and copy edit. And
Mhm.
even my very first developmental edit gave a lot of feedback on stylistic language and stuff. So
Right.
they don't hesitate to tell you there where your language is clunky or if you have some bad habits, as a writer. I made the decision that it would read in American English, which now when
Mhm.
I read it back, I realize that there's a lot of different kinds of American English, but it's proofread to American English style.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Have you had any British readers that are like, oh, you chose American English? I don't know.
No, I haven't. I haven't. I also think there's this really subtle thing in the use of language as well. Like it's been Americanized in terms of spelling and
Mhm.
usage for the most part. But there's all different ways that different locales use language. So at the end of the day, it's really the final touches on the language that make it American English.
Tell me about marketing, how you thought of marketing before book launch, and then how you've approached marketing post launch.
Yeah, I mean, I've been told that it's really important to get early reviews and also to put together a book launch team. I took that on board, and that was a really good decision because it feels like I had two stages of launch. From the time my book launch team had a chance to read my book and post their Goodreads reviews, it was a very limited audience, and that was over about a month.
Mhm.
And then after launch, then you're hoping that other people will review it beyond your book launch team and that it'll go out into the world. And I found that through my network, I was able to sell a lot of books. But
Mhm.
then going beyond my network is where I'm currently exploring. How do you find those readers that specifically want to read your book beyond just they've heard you talk about it?
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a challenge.
Well,
So I
yeah,
assume, and it sounds like that, this kind of yoga and also mind control cult angle is where you're finding some of those readers who don't already know you. Is that right?
it
So that I'm
is.
guessing I'm guessing that becomes the kind of thing where, okay, now you're looking for, I don't know, targeted Facebook ads at people who have read similar type books, or maybe there's groups. I have no idea. Tell me a little bit about what you've learned.
Yeah, so both of those, you're absolutely right. It's finding the groups. I mean, obviously, there's a big element of coercive control, mind control, which goes beyond the yoga world. And then some people who love yoga might also not be the ideal reader. Although having said that, it's, and I probably should read it, but still you could get a little bit of friction there because it may not be their view of yoga.
Right.
So it is finding people who would like this kind of story. Also, the fact that it's written in a suspenseful way, I think may appeal beyond the memoir genre. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's what I've been doing, basically looking for interested readers on Facebook as well as Instagram, a little bit of TikTok, just venturing into there, and Twitter as well. So
Okay. And what, if you were to pick one effort of yours that you feel like was a win or your biggest success or something, what was that?
So right now, if I had to say one angle that's been the strongest at this point is really finding those memoir readers,
Okay.
and specifically those who enjoy reading about cults or have written about cults. Like Daniela Mastanek Young, she's written on culture. She picked up the book and talks about it on her channel. She's interested in how wellness culture can be like a cult in America. Another win is just talking about it more than I thought I would have to after launch, just being comfortable mentioning it and finding different angles.
Right. And how about PR? I know you've been on some podcasts. How have you sought those out, and what's been your approach there?
I really enjoyed being on the Seek Safely podcast, where they talk about empowering seekers in the self help industry to be more aware of some of the dangers that exist within self help, because it's a largely unregulated industry where you can land on people who say whatever they want to. And some of them
Mhm.
are very charismatic, and there can be very similar problems of mind control and abuse.
Okay. And so, on the note of getting the story out, I've seen a couple of your posts where you've gone to local bookstores or maybe a library. Walk me through that. What is that like? How do you approach it? Do you try to figure out in advance anything about either the store or the people who work there, or is it just location based? How have you thought through that process?
Yeah, so it's been opportunistic location based. I do know that with independently published books, it's very hard to get into bookstores. I mean, once you walk in, you see that they have the most popular titles there, particularly the indie bookshops, because they have less shelf space. So
Right.
unless you make a personal contact with the book buyer and they love your story, then they're unlikely to stock your book. But I've enjoyed just going where people love reading and love books and just chatting and saying, "Hey, do you look at independent authors? And would you consider my book?" So it's just one more opportunity to talk about it. I don't have any particular way to pitch. I just approach and speak with whoever's behind the counter. And sometimes they say that they're not responsible, but they kindly take your sales sheet and a
Mhm.
copy of your book. And then I've been in places where they very kindly said, "No, that's your book. I'm ordering my own."
Have you thought about doing, or maybe you've already done any fairs, festivals, conferences, anything like that?
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to get the word out. We're a little bit over the season for a lot of them now, so I'll be applying or looking into doing that next year at this point.
I see.
But yes,
Okay, we'll have to have a follow-up convo about how that goes.
yes.
Um, let's see if there are any other aspects of the publishing part. As you think about your second book, what about the publishing side of things might you do differently, if anything?
I would hopefully know a lot more about independent publishing and make more of a plan around marketing. I mean, everyone says marketing is important. You kind of say, yeah, yeah, I've got that, but it really is time consuming. And I'm
Right.
wondering if it's particularly time consuming when you don't have a plan around it. So it kind of comes at you all the time and you think of a million different things a day and pursue different ones. And I think it's really figuring out that there are a lot of things you can be doing, but got to pick a few and
Sure.
work on those. I had heard this advice that be careful as a new author with marketing. It can be very absorbing. And if you do too many things, you will not be that good at any one of them. So it is learning. I hope to learn from this experience and tell you more next time we speak. What were the things that were particularly helpful in my genre?
Right. Okay. Have you started working then on your second book?
Only in notes. So I haven't
Okay.
opened the file yet. I think I had a file from a couple years ago when I was already planning the second book, but not really. I think I'm giving myself another month or two to just get the word out on the first one and let it
Wow.
just be notes and whatever comes into my mind versus a formal start of the manuscript.
Right. And have you always imagined there would be a second book, or was it something about writing the first one? You alluded to all these memories coming up and, maybe you wanted an outlet for them, but have you always known there would be a second memoir?
No, no, I didn't actually. Certainly not at the start of writing. I mean, I didn't go in there being like, oh, I'm going to have three books. No, I mean, I knew I had this burning reason to write one. And then as I unpacked the story, I thought there's more there. And also the decision of how much do you put in this first one? Some may have wanted more of my past or whatever to inform this first story. But I put in as much as I felt comfortable for the first book, and then I decided, no, there's another aspect, maybe a deeply psychological story. I don't know yet exactly the flavor, but I have a feeling it probably will be a deeper psychological exploration in the second book than I
Mhm.
felt like I could do in the first one.
Okay. Do you have a writing group, a critique group, or do you have a set of your beta readers and that's what works for you, or?
On this one, I did. I started off with a critique group. I was with them 2 years, and it met every 6 weeks or so. The 2 years crossed into the pandemic, so it moved online. I just felt like the format didn't work for me after a while because every time we met, we reviewed a piece of everyone's work, about 1,500
Lot.
words. It's a lot, and people were writing all different things. So I felt like my opinion on a middle grade novel was not that, well, I might say I like it, but I wasn't a critical reader of middle grade novel, as an example. So that's the other problem is we're writing from all different genres. And
Mhm.
here I'm coming out with like a very unusual story, and my critique group, I think some of them liked it, some of them didn't know what to do with it. So it's
Right.
I would look carefully at joining another critique group like that. I found beta readers extremely helpful, as you know.
Well, I've gotten to the end of my questions that I had that were burning for me. Any other, I don't know, final thoughts or a last piece of advice that maybe we haven't covered yet for others who are looking to either write their story or get it published?
Yeah, no, I would say what I always say is I would encourage people to go ahead and write their story. I found that when I doubted myself, all I needed was someone to say, well, just do it for fun. And that somehow took a lot of pressure off of it. So, yeah, if you want to write your story, just go for it and enjoy it as much as you can. I also feel that give yourself a break when you do publish. It is more emotionally intense than I had anticipated. I thought it would be a lot of work, but it's actually very emotionally intense. And it took me a while to come back to my good old self, so to speak. For a while, I felt like I was on tenterhooks there without a very specific reason. And I think it's just the reality of having a book out there and what that feels
Right.
like. So do give yourself some grace and time out and time off and
Oh,
things you enjoy, lots of walks with your dogs or whatever, or cuddles with your cat, whatever helps to just take out some of the pressure.
yeah, that's great advice. I think especially with a memoir, you're even more vulnerable giving your story to the world and making it public for the first time. So I think that's smart. So. Well, I hope you're over the hump of the like raw, intense emotionality, and now you're back to a place where you're able to maybe really enjoy it. Because, like I said, it's amazing that you've published your book, that it's out in the world. So, congratulations again.
Thank you so much, Jill. It's been great chatting with you.
Yeah, good to talk with you.